this next section, we're going to start talking about development in infancy through to childhood. Now, back in the 1890s, researchers like William James basically thought that infants were passive, disorganized, and had empty minds. He specifically said that a newborn's world is buzzing, blooming confusion. Basically, that there's lots going on and they have no way of interpreting all of those external stimuli. But we really know that that's not quite the case. Even inside the womb, infants are exposed to tactile, auditory, and chemical signals. And so those systems, the tactile, auditory, and chemical perceptual systems, are stimulated even before birth. So when babies are born, those systems are fairly operational. Though we're going to start by talking about the visual system, specifically because the visual system isn't stimulated until babies are born. When they're in the womb, they're surrounded by darkness. There's no opportunity to use and develop their visual system. So it gives us a really unique opportunity to study this system throughout its development from the very beginning. So we'll start here with the visual system. So at birth, babies have about 2,800 vision. So the standard when talking about adults would be that maybe you have 20/20 vision, where at 20 meters away, it looks like you're seeing something that's 20 meters away. In contrast, this 2,800 is basically saying that a baby's vision is 40 times worse than normal, that 20/20. So at 20 meters away, they see it as though it was 800 meters away. That's just the standard for judging vision. We can just take it as babies are very, very nearsighted. They have trouble focusing on things that are further away. And in fact, their optimal range for viewing at birth is to be about 20 to 40 centimeters. And coincidentally, or I guess evolutionarily, that 20 to 40 centimeters corresponds to the distance from that baby's eyes to their mother's face while breastfeeding. So they seem to be optimized to be able to perceive their mother's face while feeding. And so from birth, they're going to develop quite quickly. So they'll go from that 2,800 vision at birth to 2,100 vision by 8 months. So basically an 8-fold improvement in that 6-month period. And the development of this visual system is going to continue in a continuous fashion. So by 3 to 4 months of age, they start being able to organize things according to some of the Gestalt principles that you might remember from 104. Things like contours and laws of closure and things like that, organizing things by similarity. So there's some evidence that those principles start to take meaning at about that time. And even we start seeing ability to discriminate internal features of the face. So basically, the baby can tell that someone has a face. Eyes, nose, mouth, they can start picking up on expressions and telling the difference between expressions. And so this development is continuous, and in a lot of cases, it's going to develop in a step-like fashion, where there are certain milestones that they hit one after another. Now, some of you may be wondering how we can know what an infant is capable of seeing or not seeing. And that's a really interesting thing, because we can't ask babies what they can see. We can't get them to describe their experience. So we have to use some creative experimental design to figure out what's going on. And one of the most commonly used things, especially for vision, is something called a preferential looking procedure. This is a very simple procedure where you measure how long an infant is looking at a particular stimulus. So we base this setup on the idea that a newborn is going to focus on stimuli that they find interesting. So if you give them two different things to look at, they're going to choose to look at the one that they find more interesting for a longer period of time. Researchers can creatively manipulate the two visual stimuli that they show an infant to try and figure out what they show preference for. One example of this could be that they would show the same image, sort of one on the left, one on the right, but the one on the left is blurry and the one on the right is very crisp. Maybe it's a picture of a tree or something. If the infant's vision can't tell detail yet, if things still look very blurry overall, then the baby might not show any preference between a blurry and a crisp image, because to their still developing visual system, the two images look fairly similar. But as they develop and as they hit different milestones, they start being able to distinguish between the slightly blurry and very clear images, and they might start to preferentially look at the more clear image. Basically, they're going to spend more time with their eyes turned towards the clearer image and less time towards the blurry image. And if researchers test these children fairly regularly over time, they can actually get a good an accurate mark of when those children, when those babies can start perceiving those details, when they start preferring the image that has more details. And so we can actually look at an interpretation of what an infant probably sees. So using the example of a mother's face, the first image here is what they would see at about 1 month of age. Then they have at 3 months of age, and then they have 12 months of age. So that gradual refinement as they start seeing more and more detail. And this interpretation would be an educated expansion of data from a bunch of preferential looking tasks to determine how much detail they can and can't see. Now, we can also use preferential looking for a whole bunch of other things. It's not just for determining detail and what they can and can't see, but we can also start looking at preference between different types of stimuli. You can ask, what color do they prefer looking at? What items do they prefer looking at? So on and so forth. So this strange graph over here is showing us a percentage of total fixation time based on different types of stimuli. So over here, this is basically saying the larger this number is, or the longer this bar is, the more time the baby spent looking at that particular stimulus. So the thing that they prefer to look at the most would be human faces. And specifically, they show a preference for their mother's face. And it's really cool that they can actually tell their mother's face from other people's faces. So they would look the longest at a human face, longer still if it's their mother. Our next couple of stimuli are meant to illustrate that babies will prefer to look longer at more complex patterns. So things that have more detail, they spend more time looking at. Things that are simple, say like a solid color, the baby is going to spend much less time looking at that simple thing. So basically, the more complex it is, the better it is at holding that child's attention. And they even have preferences for colors. This graph here doesn't show it, but when shown all different types of colors, babies tend to show a preference towards blue and yellow colors over other kinds of colors, which is kind of cool too. Now, earlier on, right before we started talking about the visual system, I had mentioned quite briefly that our tactile, auditory, and chemical perceptual systems are operational at birth because all of those are stimulated while in the womb. But we didn't talk about how we know that those systems are operational at birth. And one of the key pieces of evidence to actually show that is the fact that even right from birth, newborns will orient towards sources of sound, tactile stimuli, or odors. And specifically, they seem to show a preference to orient towards things that are biologically relevant. So sounds like their mother's voice, things that they are familiar with. Tactile stimuli like being touched. And odors, things that are familiar to them. So they will prefer their mother's scent. So there are these innate, built-in ways where they will start orienting towards stimuli that are meaningful in their environment. So again, a little bit of that environment and a little bit of learned experience, but also maybe some biological underpinnings as well. But we'll touch more on that as we move throughout this chapter. This next slide allows us to touch very briefly on a couple of different things that newborns are capable of doing. And their ability to do some of these things actually helps us measure their development and especially their perceptual abilities. So let's talk through a couple of these. The first of the things that we can observe in newborns is habituation. If you remember from 104, habituation is a very simple form of learning where, as you're exposed to repeated stimuli, you will show a reduced response to that stimulus. So, for example, if you hear the same sound over and over and over again, you stop responding to it. And newborns show this as well, where they can habituate to different stimuli. Things like a sound being repeated to them, they're going to habituate to it, they get used to it, and stop responding to it. This ability gives us a unique way of measuring things like their ability to discriminate different sounds in speech. So if you say the same sound over and over and over again, the newborn can habituate to it. So if you're making a S sound, so you're sitting there saying s, 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 they're going to get used to that sound. But if you change it up, if you say a different sound, maybe you switch over to an N sound, and then you say maybe they're going to look or react differently because you've changed sounds. And so when their behavior changes, we can tell that they're discriminating or telling the difference between those two sounds because they were used to one of them and not used to the other. So another way to pick up on what they're capable of perceiving. Newborns are also capable of acquiring classically conditioned responses. And you should remember classical conditioning from Pavlov and his dogs, who would automatically salivate in response to a bell because they had learned to associate a bell with getting fed. In the same way, you can have newborns exhibit classically conditioned responses where they might learn to associate a specific touch or feeling with receiving milk as a reward. And so in response to that particular touch, they learn to pucker their lips in anticipation of milk. There's also some evidence for things like operant conditioning, where they will perform certain tasks to receive stimuli that they like. So they might look at a particular image in order to be shown their mother's face, things that they want to see, which is all really cool, and it's exhibited fairly early on. So the classical conditioning can happen as early as 1 to 3 days after birth. Which is just amazing as somebody who's studied learning before. We also have some evidence for some simple observational learning, where basically infants will start to try and imitate facial expressions of adults that they see. So lots of different ways that newborns are showing that they can actually interact with their environment, that they're perceiving a lot more than what the researcher at the very beginning that we talked about, who thought that they were blank slates and empty minds. But in fact, there is quite a bit going on right from birth, and we can see hints of that in certain behaviors. Most systems are going to develop following sort of a natural progression of gradual improvement, something like what we talked about in terms of our visual system. So we can look at this graph here, which is showing our, this is basically how well you see on the y-axis, where higher up is seeing better, and then age across the x here. And if we focus on this blue line, we see that at birth, newborns have that very poor eyesight, and slowly they're going to gain acuity, or being able to see better, until at about the age of 4, they're going to achieve that 20/20 vision, that sort of typical adult equivalent vision. So this gradual improvement process happens here. As a very cool aside from this graph here, at the bottom we can see this red line, and this is showing us what happens in the case of, here, an infant who was born with cataracts. Basically, their vision was obscured until 6 months old when those cataracts were removed. So up until this point, they had no real discernible vision, but once the cataracts were removed at 6 months, their acquisition of visual ability followed almost the same as the normal curve. And so this case, plus many, many others, give us the idea that in terms of visual acuity, there's a sensitive period that covers about the first 10 years of life. So as long as you gain your eyesight in that period, people tend to achieve this 20/20 vision at some point within that period, or fairly near to it. Now, this is, as I said at the beginning, sort of the standard for most of the systems that we talk about, but not all systems follow this very typical gradual improvement. We end up coming across a couple of weird ones, which we can talk about on this next slide here. So the first of these examples is sound localization. So I mentioned that at birth, newborns will orient towards sounds that catch their attention. So they start, if we draw our own graph, because the textbook doesn't provide one, they'll start with a decent sound localization ability at birth. But for some strange reason, at about 4 months of age, their ability to localize sound drops off. And then it comes back again 6 months later. So there's this weird U-shaped distribution where infants don't show this sound localization ability when they're 4 months old. There are a couple of proposed reasons for this, some being that this is about the time when their visual acuity starts getting really good, so maybe infants stop paying attention to sounds just because they're focusing so much on these new and attention-grabbing images. There's also maybe the idea that when they're first born, they've relied on sound localization quite a bit in the womb, so they're still using it, but then they stop using it because they don't really need it for a while. There's a couple of different proposals, but nobody quite knows why it drops out like that. Just that it fairly predictably drops off like that in all infants. The next of the weird things that still falls under this auditory perception is phoneme, I always say it wrong, phoneme discrimination. And we already kind of talked about this back in the language chapter, but when children are young, they have the ability to discriminate, to tell apart, and also produce all of the possible phonemes that are produced by humans, not just the language that their parents speak. And as they get older, their ability to discriminate and produce these different vocalizations starts to go away. So this curve, we can draw in another one, would look something like this, where over time their ability gradually drops off. So the opposite of the standard where there's a gradual increase for other types of systems. And while we're talking about audition in terms of perceptual development, we can talk about music perception, because even at a very young age, children start showing patterns of responses that are very similar to adults when they're hearing different musical scores. So, for instance, infants will show a preference or a positive response to consonant sounds, things that sound pleasing, And they will show displeasure in hearing dissonant sounds, sounds that don't go together well or that cause that sort of grating feeling. For the next couple of slides, we're going to move on and start talking about physical, brain, and motor development, again, from infancy into childhood. And when we're talking about this stuff, we're going to talk about maturation, which is the biologically programmed process of aging. There are two major principles that the textbook talks about in terms of governing how we grow and mature. The first of these is the proximodistal principle. Now, this is based on some Latin root words. So if we look at proximo, if you talk about the body and where things are oriented, things that are proximal are in proximity to the center of the body. So I always remember proxy as something is in proximity to me, it is very close to me. So proximal means in the middle. And then on the other side, we have distal. Distal means things that are distant from the center. So things like your fingers are more distal because they are further away from the center of your body. So when we talk about this proximodistal principle, we're saying that development is going to progress from the innermost to the outermost parts of the body. So you're going to develop from the center towards the outside. So when babies are born, their arms are formed, and they even have muscle movement, especially in their shoulders, in those proximal areas, but they have very little control or development in the distal portions, specifically as you get closer to the fingers. So there is higher development in the proximal areas and less development in the distal areas. So we develop in that direction. Similarly, the cephalocaudal principle basically says that we develop from the head down to the foot. This principle helps explain why babies are born with such large heads. That's because their heads develop first, so they're going to be much larger. Growth will then proceed towards the lower parts of the body, so babies will eventually grow into their heads. And so that's what this principle is telling us about. When we look at the brain specifically, when infants are born, their brain is only about 20% of the weight of an adult brain. And that's going to grow fairly rapidly because by 6 months of age, their brain is about 50% the weight of an adult brain. And over this time, their cells start growing in terms of size. So their cells get larger. Most of the cells in our brains are neurons. So those neurons get larger, start stretching out, and become the base work of our neural networks. So our neural networks start forming as those cells stretch out and start talking to each other. In terms of brain development, the first areas to develop are going to be those that are essential for basic biological functions. Things like our brainstem that control our breathing and digestion and things that are essential for us surviving. As we grow, the more and more complex areas, the areas that are further away from core biological functions and get us into things like associations, those start developing last. So basically, our brain grows in order of priority, where the really important stuff develops first, and then the other stuff comes later. But we finish off with things like our cortex, the outer part of our brain, things that allow us to make connections and think. And the growth rate of our brain follows the same kind of shape of a curve that we saw with our visual acuity, where you see rapid growth at the very beginning and then it slowly levels out, where by 5 years of age, our brain is about 90% the size of an adult brain. So not too far off. And so as it's growing, it's going to continue to mature, develop new synapses, become more specialized. Moving on to motor development, we tend to see this development of motor abilities following a very step-like pattern, meaning that they develop one ability and then the next and the next, so on and so forth, as they proceed through these things that happen in sort of a predictable manner. So, for example, some of the first motor developmental milestones that an infant will pass is the ability to lie prone with their chest up, so propping themselves up on their arms, but still laying on the ground. One of the next steps would be being able to sit up without support, then stand with support, pull themselves up to stand, stand alone, and then walk alone. So these are steps that children will gradually achieve. So this development is going to follow this orderly sequence, this predictable order. But the age at which these abilities happen will change depending on the children. So you can see here that each stage has sort of a range that it can occur during. And as we get further along, these ranges become wider. That's just because children will develop slightly different at different stages, at different rates, I guess is the best way to say it. So some children will start sitting up on their own much more quickly. Some will be able to sit without support more quickly, and others it's going to take them a little bit longer. There's lots of factors going on in the background that can affect things like, when were they born? Were they born premature? Were they born full term? What was their birth weight? Nutrition, exposure to stuff in their environment, all sorts of stuff going on. But yeah, so motor development is pretty much these stage-like sequences. So the sequence doesn't change. The age that they will hit any of those sequences can change. So they could start earlier or later, but they'll still pass through them in pretty much the same sequence. We have another oddball here where instead of a gradual improvement, we see another of those U-shaped functions. And this is specifically for what's called a stepping reflex. This is another one of those weird ones where when infants are very young, they'll show this reflexive response to try and put their feet down. So if you hold a baby up where their feet are just about on the ground, they'll try and move their feet to step. And they'll do this from birth up until the age of about 1 or 2 months old. And then again, oddly, it just disappears. They lose that reflex for a while, and then it comes back around 12 months of age, which corresponds nicely with when babies start trying to walk. So there are some motor functions as well that show atypical curves of acquisition, and that stepping reflex is one of them. Now, when I was talking about things that start influencing when different children will hit different stages or steps in their development, I mentioned other things that can be going on in the background that could be influencing when they're hitting that particular stage. And now we happen to come to environmental and cultural influences on development. It's kind of like I planned this. But we can talk about physical influences, things like your diet, your environment, physical touch. So we've talked already about nutrients a little bit in this chapter, where if you have access to lots of nutrients, your development is going to go faster and smoother, and you'll have all of those things that you need to develop properly. Whereas if you have a poor diet and you are lacking nutrients, then your development can be stunted. Growth may not occur as quickly, so people may be shorter than they should be as dictated by their genes. Or maybe if they don't have the nutrients to form active brain cells, then maybe their cognitive abilities are impaired. All sorts of problems with diet. Enriched environments are another interesting one to talk about. So when we say enriched, we really mean having more things going on. So you can be enriched in terms of educational type stimuli. So an enriched environment, if we're looking at things like intelligence and cognition, could be access to a good school or lots of books or a good teacher. And having that enriching environment leads to the formation of heavier brains. And that just comes from your neurons making more connections. You have more synaptic connections, so your brain is heavier and more dense. And then you see the opposite in unenriched environments. So poor environments don't have as many resources and lead to less brain development. We also even have things like physical touch. Humans are very tactile, and massaging or touching can help trigger development. Studies that look at the effects of massaging either prematurely born or full-term born babies show that in both cases, massage will help stimulate growth and development. They gain weight quicker and they show better neurological development as well. So touch seems to have a pretty profound effect on how we develop. Our sensory environment can also dramatically influence how we grow and develop. Things like visual deprivation can permanently damage your visual abilities. So even though we looked at that graph showing that a newborn born with cataracts can recover their vision, if that vision was left uncorrected for too long, if it was corrected outside of that sensitive period during which their body could compensate and recover from it, they could be left with permanent visual impairment. And this applies to other systems as well. So exposure during the critical periods is really important for proper development of those systems. So our big take-home message on these factors that are influencing our development, we have three. We have that biology sets limits on environmental influences. So our genes are going to limit what we have possible in terms of development. So even if we had unlimited access to nutrition, even if the environment was optimal, humans are only ever going to be, say, 6 or 7 feet tall. Barring a couple of mutations in special cases. But our biology limits how tall it is possible for humans to be. So the genes that we have and the framework that exists within our bodies is going to limit the extremes of our development. So our biology limits our environmental influences. The environment can only do so much based on what is physically possible given our biological framework. Despite those limitations, these environmental influences can be very powerful. So just changing the environments, going from a nurturing or enriching environment to a unnurturing and poor quality environment can have massive impacts on development. And even removing someone from a poor environment and bringing them to a better environment can actually cause a boost in their development. So environment can play a massive role and can have dramatic influences on how we develop. And we have to take into consideration the fact that these biological and environmental factors both have their own effects, but also interact with each other. So we have this sort of double whammy where enriching environments can enhance brain development, and in turn our improved brain development facilitates our ability to learn and benefit from that environmental experience, which causes even more improvement. So there's this back and forth between biological and environmental factors. And that's the enriching environment and brain development back and forth is one example, but there are lots of ways that we can see this interaction between our biology and our environment. And again, if they're powerful on their own, the interactions themselves are also very powerful. So there's lots of important factors to keep in mind when we look at development. So it's not a straightforward, this is what happens in this, in all cases kind of scenario. We have to keep in mind that development and the process can change based on a bunch of different factors and a bunch of different interacting factors, which is pretty cool.